Hey guys, I'm Urizi. This story is all about what if Naruto was a genius and was born with a red hair. Naruto was born with hair as red as his mother's, but with a face and intellect that paralleled his father, the Fourth Hokage. Will the revolution he brings be the world's salvation or destruction? Before we proceed with the story, please like and subscribe to this channel if you liked the video, and don't forget to check the description for the other works of the author if you liked the story. Let's start. Chapter 7, Companions. Kakashi had just been nodding off to sleep when his mental warning bells suddenly went off. Immediately alert again, he hadn't had to look long to find the man behind the disturbance. He didn't know who this man was, but the Jonin knew that people like him, with such little regard for others' lives, were one of the most dangerous opponents to have around. And the least forgivable. "Don't just stare at me," said the strange shinobi, swinging his katana carelessly. "Show me what you've got." Kakashi obliged. Sending chakra into his feet, he propelled himself like a bullet towards the man. His opponent's violet eyes widened in surprise as his foot connected squarely with his chest. Letting out a grunt of pain, the man flew backwards and careened through a row of gangly trees. The Jonin raised his hitayate, revealing the three tomo of the Sharingan in his left eye, and lowered his hand, Raikiri, lightning cutter. As he channeled his lightning chakra towards his hand, the deafening sound of crackling chakra filled the garden, and a focused ball of swirling blue materialized. The silver-haired shinobi was still dazed from impact, and Kakashi saw with his Sharingan that he would not have enough time to move out of the way. The instant his Raikiri was ready, the Jonin lowered his head and shot towards the stirring man, tearing up the earth behind him with the sheer aftershock. However, just before he reached the man, there was a flicker of movement he hadn't anticipated. Kakashi, to his shock, sensed a much smaller and weaker chakra suddenly being thrust between him and his opponent. His hand was already moving towards the man's heart, however, and he knew that he wouldn't be able to stop even if he had to go through the child. A surge of roiling yellow chakra, Naruto, was already moving towards them, and Kakashi, with all the strength of his will, managed to inch his crackling chakra slightly upwards. Naruto tore the boy out of the man's grasp, and to his relief, evaded his hand. However, the brief instant it had cost him gave the other man enough time to recover and leap backwards. Kakashi's hand instead slammed into the ground, the earth exploded, throwing up a huge wave of dirt. Nevertheless, taking advantage of the wave, the Jonin followed under its cover and aimed a quick kick at the man. "Whew, that was close," said the man, blocking with his katana, and then swinging it at Kakashi. Slipping under the blade, Kakashi attempted to sweep the man off balance, but he nimbly leaped over the Jonin and slashed downwards. Though evading the sharp edge, the side of the katana crashed into the white-haired ninja. He skidded backwards, the heels of his feet creating furrows in the earth. The man raised his katana once more and flipped into the air, prepared to finish off the Jonin. However, having read his movements ahead of time with the Sharingan, Kakashi rapidly channeled his chakra into his hand once more. As the man dropped down on him, unable to dodge, the Jonin plunged the shrieking lightning towards the silver-haired man. It could only be a testimony to the man's skill that he managed to get his katana up in midair, but it was no use. Kakashi's Raikiri pierced the blade, shattering it into dozens of deadly steel splinters that were sent flying through the air, and then kept going through the man's chest. The man let out a pained, guttural scream. Thick globs of red blood came gushing out of his chest. Throwing himself back, he landed heavily on his feet, panting. As he stood there, hunched over, he dropped the handle of the broken katana on the ground with a clatter. Looking around wildly for a moment, the man disappeared, and flecks of blood flew through the air in his wake. Kakashi blinked in surprise. He had missed his heart, but he had still severely injured him. The man shouldn't have been able to move, let alone move at such high speeds. Looking around for the man's violet chakra with his Sharingan, he spotted it near the exit gate. With a sinking heart, he saw nearby another chakra that he knew well. "Hell, this hurts." The man spat out thick blood, and grinned weakly. He squeezed the throat of an unconscious black-haired boy, Rai, and then nudged something on the ground with his foot. "Nice weapon you got here. Real nice. Mind if I borrow it?" Without waiting for a response, he kicked a red-bladed scythe into the air and grabbed it with his free hand. With a hateful look towards the Jonin, the man threw the genin into the air, and then swung down with his new weapon. The curved blades made a sick whistling sound as they pierced the air. Kakashi leaped into the air, and grabbed the limp body, spinning to avoid the blades. As he did so, he saw the man race out through the gate, leaving behind a ghostly, malicious laugh. Then he was gone. It was over. Kakashi lowered his hitayate back over his Sharingan. Setting Rai down on the ground, he checked the genin's vitals and let out a sigh of relief. Looking around, he saw that most of the bodies lying on the ground had only superficial injuries. The biggest damage had been done to the garden itself. His eyes widened as he found his two other genin. "Naruto," said Kakashi, running over. "Mayu. What happened?" Looking terrified, Mayu was trying to staunch a profusely bleeding wound on Naruto's bare chest. The boy was unconscious on the ground, the tips of his fingers still twitching. His yukata, which had been partially opened to reveal his chest, was torn and ragged. A long jagged shard of metal, covered in sticky blood, was on the ground besides them. Quickly putting the pieces together, Kakashi gently pushed the shocked girl aside. She obliged willingly, standing up. She put a comforting arm around a young, trembling boy that he didn't recognize. Gathering his chakra together, he prepared to use what little medical ninjutsu he knew to try and at least stabilize the boy, and then stopped. Impossible, thought Kakashi. Disbelievingly, he wiped away some of the blood that had pooled on the boy's chest, but saw that it was true. The deep wound was already healing. Even as he was watching, the skin was beginning to knit back together. Amazed, the Jonin blinked, as if doing so would somehow halt the healing. It didn't. He realized then that the sealed Kyuubi must have somehow accelerated Naruto's healing rate, perhaps by pumping out its chakra to save the boy. "Sensei," said Mayu, her voice taut with fear. "He'll be fine, it was just a shallow cut," he lied. "Shallow?" repeated the girl, her eyes widening. Kakashi wordlessly bent over, and picked Naruto's surprisingly light body up. There were shouts at the gate, and several medics came racing in. Catching one of the medics' attention, he directed them towards Rai, who was just beginning to feebly stir. When he turned back to wave for Mayu to follow him, he saw the look on her face and stopped. "Mayu." "Sensei, I already know," she said quietly. "I know what he is." When Naruto came to, everything was hazy and out of focus, and there was a sharp, throbbing pain in the right side of his chest. He was alone in a dark room. Looking down, he saw bandages covering his chest. For a second, Naruto couldn't figure out what he was doing there, before the memory of what happened came rushing back. When the piece of the metal blade came spinning at the boy in the blue yukata, Naruto hadn't thought, he'd simply just moved. The only thought in his mind right then was how much he needed, to save the boy. He'd pushed the child aside, and that was the last thing he could remember before waking up in the room. Naruto wondered briefly if he had died and this was some awful version of the afterlife, but quickly dismissed the thought. He didn't think his body would hurt this badly if he were dead. Just then, he heard footsteps outside the room, and then soft voices. Naruto tensed, wincing as he did so, before relaxing as he recognized their voices. It was Kakashi and Mayu. They were talking too quietly for him to hear, but it seemed like they were discussing something. A minute later, they must have come to a decision, for he heard Kakashi's heavier footsteps begin to walk away. There was a pause, and then the door slid open. It was Mayu. Naruto quickly closed his eyes and feigned sleep. He didn't know what to make of his female teammate, though they'd been together for months now. She'd been avoiding him the whole time. In fact, ever since the mission with the bandits, she'd made an even more apparent effort to avoid talking to him. He didn't know what she was doing in his room, and he certainly didn't want to talk to her. He heard Mayu's footsteps pad over to where he was lying down. There was a soft thunk as she set down what sounded like a small table, his dinner, perhaps. Ah, Naruto thought. So that's why she was here. But while he'd expected her to get up and leave right away, for some reason, she sat there in silence. Too wary to fall asleep, Naruto waited, forcing his breathing to stay steady. It was only after some time had passed that at long last, he heard the sound of rustling fabric. Suddenly, he felt a warm pair of hands wrap around his own. He tensed, and she squeezed. "I'm sorry." I forgive you, Maya whispered into the darkness. Then she got up and left the room, sliding the door closed behind her. As soon as her footsteps had faded away, Naruto opened his eyes. He stared at his hand for a long time. The next day, Naruto was feeling much better, and when the medic removed his bandages, saw that he was almost completely healed. When he saw how there was barely a scratch left on his chest, he inadvertently let out a sound of disbelief. Judging from how painful it had felt, he had thought the cut had been much deeper. He supposed that the shock and chaos of the moment had skewed his judgment, and Naruto felt a little silly for having delayed their return trip for so long over nothing. But just before they left the village the following day to begin going back to Konoha, the young boy he had saved came up to him. "Thank you," said the boy. Taki, he had said was his name, looking up at Naruto. He had changed out of his blue yukata into black mourning robes. His face was downcast and his eyes were red. He was probably still reeling from the shock of losing his sister, but he was much calmer now. "Thank you," he repeated, and a single tear came leaking out of his eye. It slid down his round cheek. Naruto nodded, but he didn't respond. There was a strange feeling welling up in his chest that he held back, because he knew this was just another part of being a ninja. If he wanted to grow stronger, he would have to get used to it. But after a moment, he allowed himself to pat Taki on the head. It was something he had seen others do before, and he thought it might comfort the boy. For some reason, however, Taki only began to cry harder. By the time they finally left through the gates of the village, however, the tears had dried, and Taki waved goodbye to Naruto, sniffling. As they began to walk back to Konoha, Rai demanded to see Naruto's wound. When he lifted up his shirt to reveal his mostly healed chest, Rai let out a snort, before slapping him hard on the back. And so, without major incident and only a few days behind schedule, Team 7 finally returned home. Despite everything that had happened to them, not much had changed in Konoha. The village people continued to go to the market in the mornings, and children still fought over who got to ride the swing in the playground. Naruto was still the village pariah. As he grew older, he'd finally realized that the reason people avoided him could not simply be because of his appearance as he'd once feared. But the fact of the matter was, if he entered a store without using a henge, he still got charged double the ordinary price. If he strolled normally through the streets of the marketplace, people began to group together in clumps as they noticed his red hair and whisker marks. And if children got too close to him, their parents would drag them away, scolding them. At one point, in a spark of inspiration, Naruto had wondered if perhaps his features really were a signature mark of an unpopular clan. But despite his best efforts, he'd found nothing about an Uzumaki clan in the archives, and so, could only conjecture as to why he'd been singled out from such a young age. Having gotten used to the isolation long ago, it did not bother him as much as it might once have. To him, it had simply become an unquestionable law of his world. And yet, despite everything that had stayed the same, he found that some things were not exactly the same. Kakashi had begun to regularly drop by his apartment, even on days when they didn't have a mission. Sometimes, they would pick up where they had left off in previous discussions of chakra application. Other times, the Jonin would take him to the training field and teach him some new kenjutsu or ninjutsu moves. After Naruto kept asking him about the lightning release technique he had used on Hidan, he even promised to start Naruto on learning a second nature affinity. It wasn't just his team leader. Occasionally, Rai would bang loudly on his door, demanding to spar with him. It seemed that Rai couldn't get over the fact that Hidan had knocked him unconscious so quickly, and was determined to get better. And in return for some taijutsu tips from Naruto, Rai would help Naruto with target practice, teaching him how to fasten letter bombs to kunai in discreet ways that the opponent wouldn't notice. Even Mei sometimes joined in, though she never looked for Naruto by herself. She was always with either Rai or Kakashi, but she had begun to talk to him more and more with increasing bravado. Naruto wondered if it had something to do with the night back when he was healing, and she had whispered those words to him. Thinking back on what she had said, he had tried to figure out if he had ever wronged the girl, but couldn't think of anything. It was puzzling. He had a feeling that Mei knew he had heard her words, and yet he couldn't bring himself to ask her. Still, nowadays as he trained with his team, Naruto felt light in a way that he'd never felt outside of the archives. Out in the training field, none of the other villagers were there, it was just them, the 4 members of Team Kakashi. After a long hard day, they sometimes all went to Ramen Ichiraku for bowls of Konoha's finest ramen. The first time they went, Naruto had only stared in awe as Rai and Mei squabbled over a piece of pork in one of their bowls. "You said I could have it," said Mei with an uncharacteristically ferocious glint in her eyes. "That was before I realized it was the last one," said Rai, holding it out of the shorter girl's reach with his chopsticks held high over his head. Then, making sure she could see, he popped the strip of meat into his mouth. With a cry of fury, Mei threw her chopsticks, like shuriken, at him. Skillfully, Rai batted aside the chopsticks with his own, but then froze, as the ricocheting sticks of wood knocked over Kakashi's bowl. They looked on in horror as it crashed into the ground, its noodle contents pouring out over the ground. Taking one look at the frozen smile on Kakashi's face, Rai jumped out of his seat and began to beg for forgiveness. "Why does this always happen when you're around?" the owner asked Naruto, the edges of his mouth twitching. And for the second time, Naruto found himself apologizing to him. And so, the months and seasons passed. Naruto's 11th birthday came and went with little fanfare, though to the entire team's shock, Mei baked him a birthday cake. It was his first time eating cake, and while it was actually too sweet for his tastes, he found himself finishing his portion to the very last bite. Best of all, however, was Kakashi's gift of a new tanto. Unlike the older one he'd been using, it was made of a special metal that would allow Naruto to channel his chakra into it. He made sure to polish it after every use. Team Kakashi continued to go on missions, though nothing quite as eventful as the one in Yogakure occurred. With Mei's new willingness to work with Naruto, their teamwork grew leaps and bounds and their missions became even easier to complete. That wasn't to say that their team was perfect, though both Rai and Mei were willing to go along with Naruto's direction. Rai sometimes lose focus, inadvertently deviating from the plan, and Mei had a tendency to freeze up when anything unexpected happened. But while Naruto may have once considered them to be in his way, now, he found himself thinking during his free time of how to help them improve. It was sometime into the new year, at the end of a particularly fruitful training session, when Kakashi told them that the Chunin exams would soon be taking place in Sunagakure, the hidden village in the Land of Wind. Hearing this, Naruto looked at his teammates, and they nodded back at him. He looked back at their sensei. Team Kakashi was going to be there, and if he had his way, they would all be passing. Chapter 8, Sand Ripples in the Wind. Naruto had never seen so much open space in one place before, or such a uniformity in color. As far as the eye could see, fields of golden sand stretched into the distance. The horizon was not straight, but humped with faraway dunes, and the intense, constant heat from the sun caused refractions in the air. Sunagakure, hidden sand, was not, in the strictest sense of the word, hidden. Neither was Konohagakure, hidden leaf, for that matter. The huge overhanging mountain with the busts of the Hokage carved into the cliff's face was a dead giveaway. But just like how Konoha was isolated by dense forests and mountains, Sunagakure's location was secured by the sheer extremity of its geographical surroundings. They had had to endure endless sandstorms and scale treacherous rocky cliffs for several days to reach the village. If any ordinary person or ignorant ninja had attempted the journey, they would surely have fallen long before the village's clay buildings came into view. When Naruto and his team finally arrived at the gates of the village, they were directed towards a desert space encircled by a barbed fence. Inside were dozens of huge pieces of rock that jutted out from the sandy ground. As soon as the gate to the lot screeched open, he felt at least several dozen pairs of eyes immediately turn to glare at them. Naruto had never seen such a large gathering of foreign ninja together in one place. Just judging from the Hitayate of the nearest genin, he could tell there were at least 4 other villages here, including Amegakure, hidden rain, Kyuzagakure, hidden grass, Takigakure, hidden waterfall, and of course Sunagakure, hidden sand. Naruto shifted, the tension in the air was tangible. "Ick, this place is disgusting," he overheard a genin from Takigakure complaining. "I've got mud all over my sandals. Let's hurry up and pass this stupid exam so we can go back home," her teammate grumbled. "Confident, aren't they?" muttered Rai, from besides him. He, like the other 2, were wearing thick cloth cloaks to protect them from the sun. He looked musingly around. "I wonder who the others from Konoha will be? I heard from my brother that some rookies are actually taking the exam this year. They must be really talented then, said Mayu uneasily. Her eyes darted around. I know I definitely wouldn't have been ready for it when we graduated. I don't know if I'm ready now, actually. With a shake of his head, Rai squeezed her arm comfortingly. You'll be fine. You've got me and Naruto backing you up. Mayu's face remained pale, but she nodded. While it was too early to say for sure, Naruto could already tell that the exam was not going to be a pushover. The other villages would have sent their best genin teams, and competition was going to be fierce. The question was, what kind of trials would they face? Different villages hosted the exam every time, and the tests were always different. However, he had known this from the very beginning, and they had trained with this in mind. So long as Mayu didn't freeze up, Naruto felt reasonably confident that his team would be strong contenders. They would be able to weather whatever the test threw their way. Probably. Nervous? Asked an unfamiliar voice from behind them. Naruto turned around. The approaching boy was wearing the Hitayate of Konoha, but Naruto had never seen him around before. He looked several years older than them, with long hair tied back in a ponytail and a pair of circular glasses perched on his nose. You're from Konoha too, aren't you? Well, yeah, said Rai, tapping his own Hitayate meaningfully. I'm Kabuto, he said, ignoring the cheek. This is your first time taking the exam, isn't it? Is it your first time in Sunagakuer too? Yes. Mayu gulped. Is it obvious? Kabuto smiled. Yep. You remind me of how I used to be. Is this your second time taking the exam, then? Asked Naruto. Nope, this is my fourth, he admitted. This exam is held twice a year, so this is my second year. It's my second time here in Suna as well. Unable to detect a lie from the boy's tone of voice or his body language, Naruto felt himself losing interest. He doubted anyone truly competent would fail the Chunin exam twice, let alone 3 times in a row. A glint of gleaming metal caught his eye, and turning slightly, Naruto saw the familiar leaf Hitayate again on another boy. He was pale with long dark hair, and had the unmistakable clear eyes of the Hyuga clan. He seemed calm, though his fidgeting teammates looked a bit more nervous. Naruto looked him up and down. The Hyuga clan was rumored to be one of the strongest in Konoha. He wondered how the boy before them would measure up. Mayu must have followed his gaze, for she commented, they must be one of the rookies from the class after us. I don't recognize them. Yeah, they are, said Rai, perking up and turning away from Kabuto. Pointing at a girl with Chinese-style buns, he said, the girl's Tenten. She's a weapons specialist like me. Her dad used to train us together when we were young. But before they could go over to talk to them, several clouds of swirling sand suddenly appeared at the entrance to reveal a group of Suna-chunin and Jonin. Naruto gave them their full attention, quickly taking note of their standard Suna attire. At their head was what appeared to be their leader. He was very tall, towering over much of the other Suna ninja, and had 2 red markings on the side of his face. Half his face was covered by a turban-like headgear with a sheet hanging down, and the remaining half was contorted into a hard glare. Thank you all for waiting, began the man, looking around at them sternly. My name is Baki, and I will be your examiner for the Chunin selection exam's first test. You will now all be assigned a team number, in order of your arrival here. There was a murmur of uncomfortable assent. The Chunin examiners began to walk around, giving out plates with numbers on it. Kabuto returned to his team, and Naruto and his team waited patiently for theirs, as they had been the second to last to arrive. Finally, when the Chunin arrived at their number, they received the number 79. Right after the Omegakuer team following theirs received their number, Baka gathered their attention once more. If you will look around you, you will notice the slabs of rock that have been placed in the field. Pick one, and gather around it with your team. After a moment's pause to process the information, Naruto and his team walked over to the nearest rock. The others surrounding them all hurried to do the same. Each rock was about 2 meters wide, with another 2 meters radius separating the rock from the nearest surrounding rocks, making space rather limited between each team. Squinting his eyes against the sun, Naruto craned his neck backwards to look up at the rock. It was easily over 5 meters tall. The field has been divided into 20 sections, with 4 rocks of equal height in each, and a team surrounding each rock. Your objective is to protect your rock and keep it above ground level. There are 5 ways to fail this test. 1. If your rock reaches ground level, your team automatically fails. 2. If, by the end of the time limit of 1 hour, your rock is at a lower height than any other rock in your section, your team will fail. 3. If you physically touch any of your opponents or their rocks, your team will fail. 4. If your whole team is deemed unable to proceed with the test, you will fail. And 5. If you kill any of your opponents, you will automatically fail. What? So how do you pass? History. Naruto had found that while Rai had many talents, swiftness of mind was not one of them. Basically, we have to protect our rock from the other teams, and only one team out of every 4, at the most, is going to pass. We'll have to attack the other team's rocks using jutsu or projectiles so that they're at a lower height than ours. He looked at the teams of their adjacent 3 rocks, and saw that they too were sizing him up. One team was from Kusa, and the other 2 were from Suna. The deck was stacked against them. The teams from Suna were going to be operating in their natural environment. They probably knew everything there was to know about sand and rocks, and would be using this knowledge to their full advantage. Furthermore, it looked like this first test was going to be entirely a physical challenge, which would be problematic considering their team's strengths. Naruto pondered the mammoth rocks before them. Rai's artillery alone would do little against the tough rocks, and Mayu's genjutsu would have no effect at all. His wind chakra was sharp, but he hadn't tried cutting through rock before, meaning that their best bet would probably be to take out the opposing genin. Suddenly remembering something, Naruto knelt and picked up some of the sand. He rubbed it between his fingers, and while most of it fell to the ground, some of it stuck to his skin. It was slightly moist. So? What's the plan? Prompted Rai. Naruto looked up to see that he and Mayu were looking at him expectantly. He glanced at the enemy genin. They didn't appear to be listening, but... We'll go with Plan E, he said, talking quickly. Bake, the jonin, was opening his mouth. Mayu, take the Kusa. Rai, take the closer Suna team. Begin. Immediately, a flurry of action and clanging filled the air. As Naruto quickly formed the necessary seals with his hands, he saw that the Suna genin were focusing their attentions on attacking the rocks. The genin from Kusa, like his team, were already attacking their enemy genin directly. As a stream of shuriken embedded themselves in their unprotected rock, pieces of rock shattered and crumbled down. Ignoring the attack, Naruto exhaled a small but powerful gale of wind from his mouth. Futon, Hyavua, wind release, gale. Whipping through the surrounding rocks, it careened towards the Suna team farthest from them. They jumped behind their rock, easily avoiding it. The wind blasted harmlessly against the rock, which wobbled, but otherwise remained stoutly standing. Naruto smiled. Meanwhile, Mayu had lowered her hood, and unclipped her hair clips, letting her hair fall around her shoulders. Her hands blurred into action, and as she stoked them to life with her chakra, the blue bird-shaped clips began to twitch and ruffle their feathers, swelling to twice their size. Stretching their wings, they took to the air. Suddenly, there was a shout of pain as Rai managed to hit one of the Suna genin in both legs with shuriken. The genin fell to the ground, and several chunin rapidly appeared by his side with a stretcher. As the incapacitated genin was taken away, in vengeance, the remaining 2 turned their attentions on Team Kakashi. One of them was a puppet user, and she directed her scorpion-like puppet towards Rai. It scuttled rapidly towards him, its stinger gleaming with the promise of slow-working poison. Letting out a stream of swears, Rai pulled out another scroll of artillery. Trusting his teammates to carry out their part of the plan, Naruto sat down behind the rock and closed his eyes. Making the appropriate hand seals, he concentrated on first shaping his chakra into being as thin as sharp as possible, before sending it trickling deep underground. Slowly but surely, he could feel the air pressure building up below him, and in reaction, something else began to surge upwards. In the distance, he heard further screams of pain coming from the Kusa team and felt a glimmer of pride. Mayu's genjutsu operated through her blue birds. If a bird made physical contact with another person, they would immediately fall under her trap. She could cause them to feel any sensation, including intense pain. The Suna genin probably wouldn't have fallen for the trick, seeing as how they were familiar with the birds of the region, but the Kusa genin hadn't suspected a thing. Now this left the two remaining Suna teams. Leaving Rai to handle one, Naruto fed an extra burst of chakra into the jutsu, and then finally gathered it all into a concentrated ball directly below them, futon, kyo, wind release, air bubble. Opening his eyes, blinking rapidly to adjust them once more to the sun, he inhaled deeply, rapidly forming the hand signals for his follow-up jutsu. When his lungs were full, he blew the same strong gust of wind towards the rock of the Suna team. Once again, they prepared to leap behind their rock, and froze as they couldn't. Looking down, they found their feet submerged in quicksand. With a yelp of panic as the sharp wind blew towards them, they ducked down. The wind blew over their bodies, and smashed against the face of the rock. With looks of blatant relief, they straightened up, and then froze once more, as the rock teetered dangerously. Disbelief dawning on their faces as their bodies continued to be swallowed up by the quicksand, they helplessly looked up as the rock wavered back and forth above them. After a few seconds of dangerous indecision, the rock finally lost its battle against the combined force of gravity and an unsteady base. Only the genin's screaming heads were visible above the ground now, and with a groaning sound, its base rose out of the ground as it began to fall on the immobile genin. Sweating from the effort, Naruto rapidly urged more of the air pressure to build up, which would in turn cause the underground water to gush up. Just before the rock hit the ground, the genin's faces slipped below the watery quicksand with a slurping sound. There was a tense moment of silence, in which the sounds of the other battles around them seemed magnified. Finally, a second later, the three genins' heads popped up again above ground from besides the rock, which floated on the surface. Naruto exhaled. Their faces were smeared with mud, but they were alive. Hacking and coughing out mud, they limply floated in the quicksand. Naruto had directed his wind chakra to squeeze in on itself underground, causing the gas particles to accumulate and increase pressure. As a result, the stores of water below ground had moved upwards to the surface by pure hydraulic pressure. Since they were in a desert, Naruto hadn't been expecting to have access to a source of water large enough to create quicksand, but to his surprise, there had been an abundant water source beneath them. Due credit for the discovery had to be given to the genin from Takigakuer who'd been complaining about the mud. Sitting down on the ground besides their standing rock, Naruto saw that Mei and Rai were already done. The genin from Kusa were all slumped around their rock, frothing at the mouth. Mei's bluebird was chirping from on top of one their chests. The two other Suna genin struggled as they stood pinned against their rock with multiple kunai. A destroyed scorpion puppet lay in pieces by their feet. Taking in the chaos of the quicksand, Rai raised his eyebrows. "You overdid it, Naruto." Mei was smiling, the color of her face returned to its normal shade. She raised a finger, and one of her birds landed on it. Naruto regarded the remaining desert space. The Chunin examiners were collecting the incapacitated genin, and most of the battles were still going on. The pristine rows of rocks from barely 10 minutes ago were already in shambles. Some of the rocks had been shattered into pieces, and he could see several genin moving feebly under the fragments. By the looks of it, less than 20 teams would be passing. Team 79 passes the first test, said Baki. Stand by for the second test. Chapter 9, Deep, Dark, Crystal Cave. The teams that had managed to take out their opponent teams before the time limit were all gathered in a large room with rows of clay chairs. When Naruto and his team arrived, only one other team from Omegakuer was there. Their eyes were bloodshot as they glared at Team Kakashi, and in wordless agreement, they chose seats at the opposite end of the room. As the minutes passed, the remaining teams came trickling in, each looking increasingly more bedraggled. With 10 minutes left on the clock, he noticed the Konoha rookies coming in. Despite how long it had taken them, they did not seem particularly worn down and walked in with confident demeanors. Rai noticed as well, and beckoning for Mei and Naruto to follow him, he made his way over to the girl with buns in her hair. "If it isn't Tenten." The girl perked up at her name, but when she saw Rai, her face fell. "Oh, it's you." "It's been a while," said Rai, ignoring her lack of enthusiasm. Naruto got the impression that this was not an unusual dynamic for them and wondered whether something had happened in their past. "This is Tenten, guys. These are my teammates, Mayu and Naruto." Mayu shyly smiled at them. "This is Hyuga Neji and Rock Lee," replied Tenten dutifully, gesturing to the two boys besides her. The one with the clear eyes had to be the Hyuga, meaning the one with the bushy eyebrows and the martial arts belt around his waist was Rock Lee. "Nice to meet you." "I am Rock Lee," said Lee, with a flashing grin and a thumbs up. He seemed reasonably friendly, and hadn't reacted at all to Naruto's countenance the way other villagers did. On the other hand, Naruto had never seen him before, so it was possible that the boy was one of the war orphans who'd kept to the orphanage. "You're Kakashi's team, aren't you?" said Neji, glancing at them coolly. Lee visibly perked up. "What? So you are the pupils of Guy-sensei's eternal rival. You will make worthy opponents then. Is Guy your team leader?" asked Mayu. "Yes," answered Tenten, with a warmer smile for the other girl. "You guys must be the reason why Guy-sensei wanted us to take the exam this year as rookies." Rai raised an eyebrow. "I've never heard of Guy though. Are you sure he and Kakashi-sensei are rivals?" "Are you sure you have never heard of him?" said Lee, his already circular eyes growing even wider than Naruto had thought possible. "He is the strongest jonin in Konoha, with a record of—" "You're Uzumaki Naruto," interrupted Neji. The whole time, Naruto noted, his pale gaze had not wavered from him. "The one who graduated from the academy 2 years early." Naruto blinked, he'd never heard anyone refer to him as such. "That's right," he said. "He's our local genius, the kind born only once a generation, yada yada," said Rai, throwing an arm around Naruto. With a sly smile, he added, "Kinda like you Hyuga, I'd say." "A genius," echoed Lee, the words appeared to have struck a chord with him. "I'd like to challenge you to a fight sometime, then." At that, Naruto turned towards Lee, taken aback. "This probably isn't the best venue for a fight," he said mildly. "You'll have to wait for a later test for an opportunity." Neji's eyes narrowed. "You say that like you expect to win." That hadn't been Naruto's intention, but thinking about it, he supposed it was true. "As if Naruto would lose to some rookies like you," scoffed Rai. With that, it seemed Tenten had had enough, for she seized her teammates firmly by the arms. "Will you drop it already? Let's go, guys." Although Lee allowed himself to be dragged away, Neji brushed off Tenten's hand. Nonetheless, with another hard look in their direction, he left as well. "You could have been a bit more friendly, Rai," said Mayu, watching them walk away. Rai shrugged. They were being too cocky for a bunch of rookies. His teammates' voices fading into the background, Naruto's gaze followed the retreating backs of the rookies. He hadn't gotten much of an impression of Tenten besides the fact that she and Rai seemed to have a strange rivalry going on. Moving on, there was Lee. He seemed determined to make a name for himself, judging from the way he'd instantly challenged Naruto. His heavily bandaged fists also indicated strong resolve. Lastly, Naruto's eyes flicked towards Neji. He had been a bit more scathing than expected, but Naruto felt impressed at his self-control. He'd thought when he saw him before that perhaps the calm attitude was all an act, but the first test had barely ruffled his feathers. The Hyuga boy was the real thing after all. Team Guy would all likely be strong contenders in the exam. Naruto didn't mind, so long as they didn't get in the way of Team Kakashi. He thought that the more Konoha genin that passed, the better. From a rough estimate, there were about 18 teams seated in the room, about evenly distributed in terms of villages. Many of them looked weary, with purple bruises and scratches all around their body. Only a scant few seemed relatively untouched, like himself and his teammates. Simply judging from their lack of presence, compared to the Konoha rookies, they did not seem like they would be much of a challenge for him. But looks could be deceiving. That was what being a ninja was all about, after all, blending in with the shadows and offering oneself as harmless so as to lower the enemy's guard. And then, just when the enemy had relaxed and left an opening, you struck. Suddenly, he turned around as he felt a tendril of intensely cold bloodlust creeping in from the entrance. A sandaled foot emerged from around the corner, and just as the bloodlust vanished as quickly as it had appeared, he saw Kabuto walk in, with his teammates trailing behind. Naruto closely examined the teammates, but they looked fairly ordinary with black masks covering most of their faces. He wondered, Could this be an example of precisely what he'd been thinking of just moments ago? Of a snake, coiled around its unsuspecting prey, poised to strike with its poisonous fangs? It turned out that Kabuto's team had been the last one to pass, for no one else had come in when a bell rang piercingly at the 1-hour mark. As all the gathered genin simultaneously turned to look, a pair of doors that had been closed flung open with a bang. A file of Suna Chunin marched in, with a different Jonin at their head. He looked younger than Baki, with black hair that hung over his right eye. "Congratulations on passing the first test of the Chunin selection exam," said the Jonin, his indifferent expression belying his words. "My name is Yura, and I will be your second examiner. Regardless of whether any of your teammates are capable or not, the second test will commence within the hour. But first, we will proceed to the venue for the second test." Following the Chunin past the doors they had just come through, it was revealed to be a long tunnel-like hallway that sloped sharply downwards. The walls were made of sanded rock and it was dark, lit only occasionally by stone torches. As they shuffled in silence down the steps, Naruto looked around. The air was growing increasingly colder and damper, and the sputtering lights from the torches were growing weaker. It seemed the second test would be taking place underground. Mayu stumbled beside him, and as Naruto reached out to steady her, he suddenly noticed how pale her face was. "Are you all right?" he asked. He wondered if she had gotten injured during the first test, and whether it would be serious enough to affect them in the second test. "Yeah, I just don't like feeling trapped in small spaces," she said, pulling away from him. Naruto exchanged looks with Rai, who tried to say something to her. She ignored him however, and for the rest of the journey, she didn't talk again. After 20 minutes, the ground finally leveled out again and soon, they emerged into what appeared to be a narrow underground cavern. There were 12 gaping human-sized tunnel holes in the opposite rock wall. A torch burned beside each entrance. Naruto immediately realized the nature of the second test. It was likely going to be some sort of maze. Besides him, Mayu must have come to the same conclusion, for she began to tremble. "I will now explain the details of the second test. And then, before starting, I will need everyone here to sign these agreement forms," said Yura, standing in the middle of the cavern. With a rustling sound, one of the Chunin pulled out a sheaf of papers and began passing them out. "There will be deaths in this test, and it won't be against the rules this time. So if I don't have you sign these, it will become my responsibility." It was silent. "In this test, it will be a survival of the fittest. Each team will enter the maze through a tunnel in the order that they passed the first test. Here are some details about the maze. We are 200 feet below ground level, and if you take the correct path all the way through, it is about 3 kilometers long before ending up at the surface. All the tunnels intersect one another at multiple points. Using whatever weapons and jutsu you have available, your objective will be to obtain 2 team plates. This includes your own team plate, so if you manage to protect yours, you need only secure one other one. If your team plate is taken, you will need the team plates of 2 other teams. To pass this test, you and your team must reach the end of this maze with 2 team plates. They're cutting us at least in half now." A genin grumbled. "There is also a time limit. This second test will last 120 hours, which is exactly 5 days. You will be given a torch, but there are other sources of light within the maze. As for food and water, well, you'll have to figure that out on your own." Yura's eyes gleamed maliciously. "Those who cannot learn to adapt will die from the harshness of the course. Now, I will talk about what will disqualify you. First, those that don't make it to the end of the tunnel with 2 plates within the time limit. Second, anyone who creates their own tunnels that reach to the surface. And third, anyone who destroys a team plate." A genin from Omegakure raised his hand. "What if not everyone on our team survives?" "Your objective is to reach the end of the tunnel with 2 plates, said Yura. "Even if you are the only surviving member of your team, you will pass if you complete this requirement." He gestured towards a copy of the form in his hand. "That is all, so after signing the form as a team, go stand by one of the entrances. 1 team per entrance only." As the genin signed the forms, Naruto stared down at the paper in his hand. The second test was very telling of the remainder of the exam, as well as the code that the shinobi of Suna lived by. It was apparent that for Suna, the accomplishment of a mission took precedence over the lives of the ninja. Failure was not an option. Furthermore, the fact that the entire team was not required for completion of the second test indicated that the third part of the exam, unlike the first two, would test individuals. The third test would likely pit the remaining contenders against one another in direct battles. Do you think any of these tunnels are easier than the others? Mused Rai. By the time they'd handed in their forms, half the teams had already picked an entrance. They now waited outside one of the tunnels, tensely waiting for the rest. Possibly, said Naruto. But he said that they intersect, so it's unlikely to matter. He looked at Mayu, who had stopped shaking during the explanation but was still pale. He hesitated, searching for the right words. He still wasn't used to comforting people. The tunnels should widen, so it shouldn't be too bad, Mayu. Thanks, she said with a weak smile, but remained quiet. Naruto supposed it could have been worse. Since the team from Omegakure had been the first to pass, they were the first to disappear into the gaping black hole. As the sounds of their footsteps faded, a Chunin examiner walked up to Naruto and his team and marked their team number by the entrance. Rai lifted a torch from its handle. Good luck, Kabuto called out good-naturedly from 2 entrances away. His masked teammates besides him looked at them sullenly. Naruto was spared from having to respond when, just then, Yura gave them the signal to go. Taking a step forward, they walked into the darkness. The light from the cavern behind them quickly faded, and the tunnel began to curve slightly to the right. When they turned the corner, the cavern completely disappeared from view and the only light now came from the torch in Rai's hand. However, the fire was weak and was barely strong enough to light up the path directly in front of them. Naruto wondered how long it would last. The wood was burning slowly but surely, and Naruto estimated that unless the Chunin examiners were going to stroll over and replace them for them, which was extremely unlikely, it would burn out within several hours. Then, they would be left in the pitch dark. Having trained in the dark before, Naruto wasn't worried, but he wondered how Maya would fare. Do you hear something? Rai suddenly said. Naruto stopped, and listened carefully. Sure enough, he could hear something echoing far ahead. It sounded like dripping. It's probably water. Water? Down here. Remember how we had to climb those mountains to reach Suna? Said Naruto patiently. Mountains are just tilted layers of porous sedimentary rocks, and they usually run under the desert. Whenever it rains or snows, they soak into the layers, creating reservoirs of groundwater. The water should be safe to drink too. During his preparation for the exam, Naruto had made sure to put aside a day in the archives to research the prominent geography of Wind Country, and was now glad he'd done so. Well, if you say so, Rai shrugged. So now that the issue of water's solved, what's the plan for food in this maze? There'll probably be some animals that we can eat around here, Maya said suddenly. As Naruto had predicted, the tunnels had gradually widened in diameter as they walked further inside, and it seemed she felt better with more space around them. I think we should find food and water first, before anything else. Naruto nodded. And after dealing with food, we should find a secure location. It'll be difficult finding somewhere truly hidden inside these tunnels, so we should look for a place with more space to prepare an ambush. For tonight though, we should conserve our energy and just rest. Other teams will be worked up and trying to attack one another first, and they'll be easy pickings for us later on. They picked up their pace, and soon saw a pale blue light in the distance. When they reached the light, they found themselves emerging from the narrow tunnel into a large cavern that was easily 3 times the size of the one they had left before. The ground was clustered with large boulders and the walls were lined with something that was emitting the light. As the other two gawked up at the sheer size, Naruto cautiously went over to the wall. Touching it, he realized what Yura had meant by other sources of light. It was a soft and mossy type of plant that he had never seen before, and it glowed, washing the cavern in watery blue light. All of a sudden, Mayu let out a cry of alarm. Immediately, Naruto spun around to face her, and saw something small and black streaking out from behind a gray boulder. Rai threw a kunai, striking the thing right in its chest. It let out a small squeal before slumping on the ground. Stepping forward, he nudged it with its feet. It was a small furry mole-like creature with a pink snout. Looks like we've found our dinner. Naruto eventually found the source of the dripping water to be a crack in the wall. Chipping holes into fist-sized rocks with their kunai, they took turns collecting water. Then, after hunting down several more of the mole-like animals, they nestled themselves behind a boulder with their findings. After Rai skinned the animals, Naruto had just begun to ponder how to cook the meat over their dying torch when Mayu revealed something about herself that took him by surprise. "Your chakra nature is fire?" asked Naruto. On further thought, he supposed he shouldn't have been surprised. The fire chakra nature was common among shinobi of Konoha after all. But she had never before demonstrated knowledge of any fire-based techniques. Mayu nodded shyly. "I'm not very good at it though, so I usually stuck to genjutsu." "How does it work?" "Well, I gather the chakra in my stomach and then kind of put pressure on it, heating it up. Then when it's ready, I blow it out, and Here, let me show you." Her hands moving quickly to make the signs, she blew lightly on the wooden torch. "Katon, Takebai, fire release, bonfire." A stream of fire came out from her mouth which, though on the weak side, nevertheless strengthened the torch's flame to a respectable level. "That's handy," Naruto said, beginning to think of how he could incorporate this unexpected ability into their future plans. For some reason, Mayu turned pink at that, and avoided his gaze for a while. After cooking the meat over the torch and eating it, it was stringy but edible. They had just put out the fire and covered their tracks, when another team entered the cavern. Naruto, hearing their foreign footsteps, noticed first, and quieted the two down immediately with a raised fist. As Rai and Mayu lowered their bodies against the ground, Naruto crept to the side of the boulder and peered around its edge. When he saw who it was, some of the tension left his body, but he remained hidden. The rookies of Konoha wandered through the cavern, looking just as amazed by the light-emitting moss as they had been. "Amazing! Truly, this is a springtime of youth," said Lee, punching the air. Tenten shushed him. "Is there another team here, Neji?" Naruto saw the Hyuga boy turn around, and immediately noticed that the veins around his temple were bulging. His Byakugan was activated. The boy looked directly at the boulder where Naruto and his team were currently hiding behind, and smirked. "Yeah, but lucky for them, we'll leave them alone for now," said Neji. "Come on, let's find another place to find shelter." His teammates nodded without protest, and they leaped to the exit on the other side of the cavern. Once it was safe, they came out of hiding. "I really hate that guy," Rai muttered. Though they couldn't see the sun, they could feel in their bodies that the hour was getting late. Taking into consideration Mayu's poor condition, it was down to between Naruto and Rai to take the first watch. While Mayu crawled into a sleeping bag she'd summoned from a scroll, Naruto and Rai looked at one another. The other boy jerked his head. "Go on, I'll stand watch first. I'm not sleepy anyways." Laying down on the ground and looking up at the dark ceiling, Naruto wondered whether the sun had set yet. While his internal clock told him that it was likely around 6 in the evening, it'd probably been thrown off an hour or two since they'd traveled to Wind Country. Truthfully speaking, he couldn't wait for this test to be over, so they could return to the surface. Before going to sleep, he usually liked watching the sunset from his window. Not being able to see the sky was unsettling. He had just been about to drift to sleep when suddenly, a voice spoke up near his head. "Hey, Naruto," whispered Rai. "You awake?" His eyes snapped open, instantly alert. Despite the glow of light from the moss, it was dark enough that all he could make of Rai was a vague body outline. "What is it?" "I just wanted to know, what did you do to Mayu?" He'd never heard Rai speaking in such a serious tone before. Somewhat alarmed, he asked, "What do you mean?" There was a pause. "You wouldn't know it, but I've known her my whole life, so I know, once she decides something, it's pretty much impossible to change her mind." Another pause. "Mayu didn't like you, did you know that?" "I had an inkling," Naruto said drily. "Actually, everyone I know hates you for some reason, so I figured you must have done something really bad." Rai abruptly broke off when Mayu shifted. For a moment, it was silent, and then her soft, steady breathing resumed. He cleared his throat. "Anyways, do you remember that day when we had to fill out our birthdays in a calendar at the academy?" "What about it?" "That's when I realized that, well..." Rai hesitated. I guess you already know that you were born on the day of the Nine Tails attack. I was really young so I barely remember it, but my parents were killed on that day. And it's stupid, but, you kinda look like a fox with your whiskers, so it used to give me the creeps. Naruto blinked, taken aback despite himself. The Nine Tails. He had once wondered as well whether he was an orphan because of that attack. But for some reason, he'd never even considered it as a possible link to the reason behind his ostracization. His head beginning to throb, he massaged his temples, and as such, he almost missed Rai's following words. Still, you know, whatever anyone else says, we definitely wouldn't have made it this far without you. And, Rai added in a grudging tone, I don't know what you did, but I think even Mayu kinda likes you now. With that, Naruto heard Rai rise to his feet and he walked a distance away. All was silent, except for the sound of steady breathing. Naruto lay still. He wondered why Rai had told him this, and what it was that he wanted from him. He opened his mouth, but couldn't think of anything to say, so he kept quiet. Since they had put out the fire, it was cold in the cave. But it also felt just a bit warm. Probably due to the heat emitting from the moss, he thought to himself. Chapter 10, Dark Clouds Approach. When Naruto opened his eyes, he was momentarily disoriented by the glowing blue lights around him before he remembered where he was. They were somewhere deep under Tsunagakur, in the midst of the maze of the second test. They had figured out how to get water, food, and had found shelter for the night. Now, they would have to decide how to fulfill the second set of requirements of the exam, obtaining another team's number plate while protecting their own. As he grew more alert, he was shaken out of his thoughts when his nose picked up the aroma of roasting meat wafted through the air. His stomach growled, and he got up, sniffing the air. Turning around, he saw Mayu sitting beside a small makeshift campfire. From the looks of it, she had prepared breakfast as they slept. Much of the color in her face had returned, and judging from the small smile on her face, she certainly felt better. She was currently turning several stone sticks skewered through meat and what looked like yellow vegetables over the flickering fire. Naruto sat down on the ground beside Rai, who gave him a nod but otherwise, to his relief, made no indication of the conversation they had shared the previous night. Instead, sharing identical looks of gratitude as Mayu offered them their portions, they dug in. It was quiet for several minutes as they ate, watching the shadow of their fire dancing on the moss-covered walls. Finally, Rai spoke up. Now that we're rested and all, he viciously tore a chunk of meat off of his stick. Ish time to shake out some root keys, yeah? Mayu frowned. That's disgusting. Rolling his eyes, Rai began to chew even more noisily than before. Ignoring them, Naruto decided to dive straight into business. It's been about 13 hours since the test began, leaving us with just under 110 hours. We can either wait for the last 2 days, or strike fast and finish early. If we wait it out, it's likely that we'll get our choose of the pickings among the weaker teams still remaining. But the ones who still haven't passed at that point might be more desperate, more dangerous, Mayu pointed out, her pink face tinged with worry. And on top of capturing another plate, we also have to start thinking about reaching the surface, right? Trailing off, she turned to Naruto searchingly. It hadn't escaped his notice how Mayu had begun to speak up in their discussions. It was a welcome change to the wall he'd once felt like he was talking at. Desperation breeds desperate measures, he said. So we should try and finish this quickly and early. And like you said, Mayu's face brightened, it'll be best to start mapping out the maze while keeping an eye out for enemy teams and booby traps. Every time the tunnels diverge, we'll mark the path we took, and if we come across it again we'll take the other path. Sweeping sand over their campfire, they quickly concealed all signs of their overnight presence. Working under the assumption that Neji would have used his Byakugan to choose the best possible route, they then left the blue cavern through the same tunnel Naruto had seen the rookies go through the day before. As the dimly lit pathway rapidly decreased in diameter, they were forced to walk closer together. Naruto felt Mayu shudder, and picked up their pace. Soon, however, they stopped, as the tunnel forked into 2 different paths, one widened out and sloped upwards, while the other narrowed and sloped downwards. So, which one will it be? Said Rai, eyeing the 2 paths. Mayu wordlessly edged towards the wider path, making her preference obvious. Yeah, but, That's exactly what they'd expect us to take, right? Without responding, Naruto positioned himself directly in the middle of the fork and closed his eyes. He raised both of his arms, and then a moment later, opened his eyes. He began to head down the wider path, and motioned for his teammates to follow him. I can feel a slight breeze coming from this path, he explained when he saw the questioning looks on their faces. The air from the other side is still, so it's likely a dead end. They shared bemused looks but trusted his judgment. However, while they navigated through the tunnels of the underground maze, they were forced to resort to a wide variety of tactics. Mayu sent out her bluebirds ahead of them, and they provided a constant stream of information, which, though limited, was helpful in sketching out their mental map of the caves. Rai kept a sharp eye out for signs of fights and scuffles as well as keeping track of which tunnels they had already went down. Meanwhile, when Naruto wasn't able to discern any difference between the wind currents of a split in the pathway, he sent out a shadow clone down one while they walked down the other. After several hours, during which they made fast progress, Naruto suddenly came to a halt and winced. One of the shadow clones he had sent out 20 minutes ago had just fallen into a pit full of fat larvae before promptly dissipating. Shivering at the sensation of crawling all over his body, he narrowly almost missed the extra shadow that flickered behind them. Without reacting or changing his expression, Naruto began to walk again. Raising his hand to brush a lock of his hair out of his eyes, he twitched his pinky. Glancing sideways, he made eye contact with Rai, who gave an imperceptible nod. Dramatically making groaning sounds, Rai slumped down on the ground. "Man, I'm starving," he complained. "It's about time for lunch, isn't it? We've come pretty far, let's find some food now." "I agree," said Naruto, crossing his arms. "Let's take a break for now." "Well, alright then," said Mayu. "I'll collect some vegetables, so how about you two get the moles?" "Sounds good," said Rai, pulling out a kunai and twirling it in his hand. "Come on, Naruto. Let's go find some moles." At his last words, he jumped up and disappeared. A moment later, he reappeared at the opposite end of the tunnel, holding his kunai to the neck of a dark-skinned male genin. At the same time, Naruto swiftly threw a shuriken up at the ceiling. The other genin who had been hanging above them, a stocky blonde male, managed to avoid the shuriken as he scuttled down the wall to the ground. Without a look back at his teammate, he fled to the nearest hole and disappeared. Naruto didn't move, watching the hole expectantly. Several seconds later, there was a yelp of shock and pain from the direction the genin had ran to. The sound of something being dragged across rough ground reverberated through the hollow tunnel, and soon, his shadow clone emerged, dragging the unconscious genin behind him by his collar. The shadow clone tossed the body to the ground beside where Rai stood with the other struggling genin. They tied the two genin together against a boulder, and as Mayu searched their bodies for their team plate, Naruto looked around the surrounding tunnels warily. Judging from their Hitai, they were from Takigaku, but it looked like they were just a two-man team. When he had first detected their presences behind him, he had thought that perhaps their third member was farther behind and acting as backup. But he couldn't detect a third presence anywhere, meaning that their third member was either too far away, or that they had somehow lost their third member. Naruto played with the idea that their third had managed to conceal their presence from him, but he dismissed that almost instantly. Though poorly lit with ample shadows to hide in, these tunnels were far too narrow and cramped for anyone to continuously hide from him for this long. "Where's your third? Is he waiting to ambush us, or what?" Rai voiced Naruto's thoughts, nudging the dark one who was still conscious. The genin scowled ferociously, glaring at them through narrowed eyes. "Like I'd tell you, little br. Ow, ow." He broke off as Naruto's shadow clone shoved him down with his foot. Naruto kneeled beside the genin, and looked him directly in the eye. As the genin watched with horror growing in his eyes, he then pressed the tip of his kunai against the inside of the genin's fingernail, putting in just enough pressure to induce pain. "First it'll be your fingernails, and then your fingers, that is, unless you talk. Where is your other teammate? Didn't you hear me the first time?" The genin spat at his feet. "You're not gonna get nothing outta." He broke off and let out a howl of pain as Naruto thrust his kunai up. With a sick popping sound, his nail fell off. "Naruto," said Mayu, her face pale. She stepped forward, but Rai held her back. He looked a little green as well, but his jaw was set. "That was just a fingernail," said Naruto softly. The genin's eyes widened, tears of pain leaking out. "Imagine how much more it would hurt if I did that to a finger." All right. She's not here, we ditched her," he yelped. "We don't know where she is." Naruto stood up. He could tell from his body language that the genin was telling the truth, or at least, believed it. Swinging his kunai up, he hit the head of the genin with its blunt end, knocking him out. The genin's head crumpled down against his chest. He looked up to see Mayu staring at him with wide eyes. Internally, he let out a sigh as he saw something in her face that he hadn't seen in a while: fear. "Was that really necessary?" she asked. "We're ninja, Mayu," snapped Rai. "This is what we do. Stop being such a baby." Mayu didn't respond. Instead, she put the hood of her cloak up over her head. Rai grabbed the team plate she had been clutching in her hand. The number 44 was engraved on it. He tossed it into the air, and then grabbed it before tucking it into his pocket. Ha! That was easy. Leaving the trussed-up genin behind them, they silently walked through the dark tunnel while Naruto's shadow clone slunk back into the darkness to trail them. As Naruto watched Mayu stiffly move away from him, he felt his heart sink a little. He didn't feel any remorse for having handled the situation in that way. Torture was a proven and surefire way of quickly retrieving necessary information. But he wondered if he should have held back for Mayu's sake. It was unfortunate that despite her valuable skill of perception, she had always been the least desensitized of the three and the most averse to solutions to situations that required violence. Naruto sometimes questioned whether she was truly suited for the life of a ninja. As someone who clearly didn't have the heart or the stomach for a ninja's work, it was a wonder how she'd come into it in the first place. Not for the first time, he wondered what he would do if Mayu ever got in the way of a mission. So far, it hadn't proved to be much of an issue, but the missions that awaited them in the future could only be filled with more bloodshed. Suddenly, Naruto came to a halt. In one sleek motion, he pulled out his tanto from its sheath as the memories of his shadow clone flooded his mind. It had just been attacked from behind. The last thing it had seen before disappearing was a flash of white. Before he could let out a warning, a high-pitched voice called out from behind them, "Stop right there." Shock flooding his system, Naruto spun around, dropping into an offensive stance. Besides him, his teammates mirrored his actions. However, the genin that they saw remained calm and seemingly defenseless even as she casually walked towards them. She had short, spiky hair and curious orange eyes. Naruto's eyes flickered to the Hittite slung around her right arm. The waterfall symbol of Takigakuer stared back at him. That, and judging from the way she was alone, she was likely the third teammate that had been abandoned by the genin they'd captured their plate from. Naruto's grip on the tanto in his hand tightened. His shadow clone hadn't even sensed her coming up behind him. He had thought that was impossible in such a closed space. He could feel it in his bones. Despite her seemingly harmless exterior, his every nerve was screaming that she was dangerous. There was something foreign about the girl that caused a chill to rack his body, foreign, and yet at the same time, somewhat familiar. But before he could puzzle over it further, his teammates sprung into action beside him. Rai released a barrage of shuriken at the girl, while Mayu's bluebirds shrilled, taking off into the air. Dodging the shuriken, the girl picked up speed and began to run towards them. Jumping up over the birds, her hands blurred as she opened her mouth. Hiden, Rinpungakuer no Jutsu, secret, hiding in scale powder technique. Prepared to counter it, Naruto gathered his chakra into his lungs, his hands blurring through the signs: futon, daitapa, wind release, great breakthrough. He blew, expelling a strong wind from his lips. However, to his surprise, what came out of her mouth was something powdery that sparkled, lighting up the tunnel around them. Before Naruto could wonder at its purpose, it made itself clear as the powder rapidly brightened into an intense light akin to that of the afternoon sun, sending searing hot pain into his eyeballs. Rai howled in agony beside him, and Naruto shut his eyes reflexively. He heard the wind he had exhaled continue blowing through the tunnel, but it was too late. The powder had done its work. Opening his eyes, he could only see throbbing circles of yellow and orange that threw him off balance. He staggered. "Shouldn't have done that," said the girl. Judging from her voice, she was standing right in front of them, and yet, to his growing alarm, Naruto couldn't sense her presence at all. What the hell is this? Rai snarled. The intense white light was gradually dimming, but Naruto could still only make out, at best, several blobs around him. The name's Fu, she said. That was my scale powder technique, but don't worry, the effects aren't permanent. Usually, anyways. Well, I'm just here to get my team plate back. So, which one of you has it? Rai must have given himself away with an involuntary twitch, for the girl immediately pounced on him. Ah, so you do. There was a muffled yelp and a rustle of clothing. Thanks. See ya laters, alligators. There was a pause. Or not. His vision was restored enough now so that he could see a faint shadowy figure bouncing up and running away from them. Rai made to get up, but Naruto held out a hand to stop him. Rai growled in frustration. What is it? Don't, panted Naruto. We're at a disadvantage right now. It'll be easier to obtain another team's plate than to try and attack her, it isn't worth the effort. Rai let out another snarl of anger, spitting on the ground, but sat back down. Damn that girl. Picking up a pebble from the ground, he flung it at the wall. And that genin bastard. He lied to us. I'm gonna kill him. I don't think he was, said Mayu quietly. They were probably traveling separately. Why the hell would they do that, when she's got that technique? But none of them had an answer for that. Once their vision was finally restored, they began to press forward again. However, Mayu soon stopped them as her birds informed her that there was an impassable pit up ahead, and they turned around. As they silently walked back along the same path, Naruto's mind buzzed over the recent unexpected turn of events. He hadn't taken the exam seriously enough, obviously. The other team's plate had initially been as easy to capture as expected, but they'd barely had time to even look at the number before it'd been taken back by that girl. She'd said her name was Fu. He hadn't been able to gauge her offensive ability, but she'd exuded a kind of confidence that only came with years of experience. Naruto had chosen not to follow her, explaining it to his teammates that their time would be better spent hunting down other teams, but he had to wonder, had it been influenced by doubt, by fear, at all? He didn't doubt his own abilities. He believed that in a direct confrontation, he could take the girl down so long as he avoided her strange powder. Nevertheless, something about her unsettled him. With Rai still fuming and Naruto lost in contemplation, Mayu was the first one to spot the obstacle in their path. She let out a small "oh" of surprise, and stopped. Returning to his senses, Naruto peered ahead at the dimly lit path, and saw the two genin they had left behind still tied to the boulder. From the way they were sitting, he could tell that the blonde, the one he had knocked out, was still unconscious. However, the dark-skinned one that Rai had handled was now awake, and glared at them hatefully. A trickle of blood had dried halfway down his face. Did she not see them or something? Muttered Rai, walking over and nudging the blonde experimentally with his foot. He turned to the dark-skinned genin. Oi, did your third teammate pass by? That thing's not a teammate of mine, the genin said coolly. Despite his obvious anger, he seemed more level-headed and in control than his teammate. Rai scratched his head. Well, she took your team plate back from us, he confessed. Wouldn't it have been logical for her to have freed you guys while she was at it? Monsters aren't logical. Monster. Repeated Naruto. He noticed Mayu stiffening in surprise beside him, but ignored it. What do you mean? The genin looked up directly at Naruto, and for a moment, he thought that the genin wasn't going to respond. Next to him, the blonde genin suddenly twitched, his eyelids fluttering as they struggled to open. He let out a low moan. The genin's features twisted into one of utter loathing, and his eyes burned with a look that Naruto somehow found familiar. She's a Jinchuriki? What's a Jinchuriki? Asked Rai. Just then, the blonde jerked and his eyes snapped open. Looking around wildly, he spotted Naruto standing by with his arms crossed and flinched. Gradually, as he took in the scene, a look of horror began to dawn on his face. She's got a monster sealed inside of her, she's Takigaku's weapon, explained the genin. Upon hearing his teammate, the blonde's head whipped back as though he'd been slapped. Mushimi. What are you doing? He hissed. That's a village secret, and what about the plan? I don't care, the genin, Mushimi, growled. That thing killed my parents before they sealed it away. I want it dead. And I have my doubts about the plan. The blonde's mouth dropped open. I know how you feel. But remember what Hike-sensei said to us about telling anything to outsiders. Do you even realize what you're doing right now? If it means I have to betray our village, so be it. The conviction rang loud and clear in his voice. By monster, what do you mean? Asked Naruto slowly. As Mushimi opened his mouth, the blonde genin struggled in vain to release himself from his bindings. Shut up. Mushimi. A tailed beast. The seven tails, said Mushimi, glaring up at them. So go tell your village and your Hokage. Go tell them that Takigaku's raising up a weapon, in order to become one of the 5 great villages. Come and destroy it for us. Chapter 11, Confrontation of the Black Shadow. October 10th, the day of Naruto's 8th birthday and every birthday before that, was Memorial Day at Konoha. It was always a cold, dark, and somber day, as though the skies themselves were in mourning. The sun hid itself behind its clouds, which loomed heavily and slowly over the village. The villagers, all garbed in black, gathered around the memorial marker for the fallen heroes of the day the Nine Tails attacked. Even at the academy, there was always a special history lesson to begin the day for every class. The year before, when Naruto had been in Iruka's class, the Chunin had recounted for them how the shinobi of the village had fought bravely, holding off the Nine Tails from the rest of the village as they waited for the fourth to arrive. Then, they had a moment of silence, before they resumed normal class activities. But Naruto had been transferred to a new class 2 years his senior, and he found this year that his new instructor, a Chunin named Mizuki, conducted the lesson rather differently. Glossing cursorily over what the ninja had done, the man seemed to relish in describing the Nine Tails in detail. According to him, it was a colossal leviathan and each lashing tail rained destruction on the world every time it was swung. It was an uncontrollable force of nature, with fangs as long as a grown man and eyes that seethed with the burning fires of hell. The Nine Tails was a roiling, churning ball of evil, with only one intention in mind, to destroy anything and anyone in its path. A student raised his trembling hand and asked, "But the fourth killed it, right, sensei?" A murmur of uncomfortable agreement spread throughout the classroom. The students had all of course grown up hearing in their bedtime stories about the monster that had terrorized the prior generation, but they'd never had reason to fear it. Because always, at the end of every story, their mother or father had finished the story by saying, "The fourth Hokage, a hero who loved his village and who was loved by the village, was able to protect us. At the cost of his life, he defeated the Nine Tails so that the future generation, so that you, could in turn grow up to be fine shinobi and continue protecting Konoha." With a kiss to their forehead, and a click as the light turned off, they had always fallen asleep with smiles on their faces and dreams of becoming the next hero to save their village. But a strange, sly smile stretched across Mizuki-sensei's face as he heard the student's question. "Well," he said, "the fourth certainly dealt with it for us. And that is why he is today a hero." The Chunin bowed his head downwards in a show of respect, and all the students automatically copied his gesture. However, just before Naruto obediently complied, Mizuki tilted his head and glanced in his direction. And for a moment, Naruto thought that the Chunin's eyes had lingered on him with a cold glint. But an instant later Mizuki's gaze moved on to look fondly over the students. After a moment's hesitation, Naruto thought it more likely the fault of his overactive paranoia. Mizuki-sensei had treated him fairly over the past year, and seemed to bear no ill will against him. It wouldn't do for him to poison the opinion of his instructor, when he had so little support as it was. As he lowered his head, Naruto wondered briefly what Mizuki-sensei had meant by dealt. He hadn't directly answered the student's question. Could that mean that the Nine Tails was still alive and roaming the wilderness? Naruto's head hurt at the possibility, and he instantly dismissed it. The fourth had been too great a man to have simply chased the beast away. He would have dealt with it in the best way possible for the village. And what else could that be, but to kill such an untamable monster? Team Oboro, hailing from a Megakur, never even saw it coming. Their plan had been to wait to the midpoint of the exam, so that the strongest teams would have finished and the weaker teams would have worn themselves out. They were still in top shape and pumped for action by then, and with their nearly perfected strategy of genjutsu and clone techniques, procuring a plate from the first exhausted genin team, from Suna, as it were, that passed by had been like taking candy from a baby. Armed with the necessary plates and the intelligence that their allied Ame team had given them prior to the exam, they'd been on course to reaching the exit of the maze and passing the second exam with ease. If they hadn't gotten so caught up in the elation of their seemingly imminent success, they might have lasted a few seconds longer. Their first indication of danger was when Mubi dropped his umbrella on the ground with a clatter. The boy himself quickly followed after, convulsing uncontrollably on the ground as white froth bubbled out from the side of his mouth. Reacting instinctively, Kaguri and Oboro jumped away from their teammate, just in time to avoid the two kunai that now embedded themselves harmlessly in the ground. Kaguri's and Oboro's hands both blurred, Bunshin no Jutsu, clone technique. As several clones appeared around them with swirling clouds of mist, they rapidly continued to form seals in succession, Doton, Doku Igayo no Jutsu, Earth Release, Earth Swim technique. The earth below them turned fluid, and the two rapidly sunk below its depths, leaving behind their clones. Sure enough, a few seconds later, the tremors of unmistakable battle filtered through the earth towards them. Oboro turned to Kaguri, who nodded back at him, his eyes narrowed from behind his rebreather. The two burst back up to the surface, spinning in midair as their umbrellas rapidly spat out poison-tipped needles in opposite directions. All around them, as they stood back to back in their practiced stances, their sacrificial clones burst into mist. Oboro blinked at the dark clearing around them. "Where are they?" he hissed, looking around rapidly. Given that they hadn't even sensed their enemy creeping up on them, he hadn't expected to take them out so easily, but he hadn't expected the enemy to simply not be there. But all he could see was Kaguri's anxious face besides his end. What was that small blue thing fluttering around above them next to that stalactite? Wait, was that a bird? This far underground? Before he could even open his mouth to yell out a warning, however, his remaining teammate dropped like a stone besides him, white froth creeping out from his orifices. Oboro felt his heart sink as he remembered the promise he'd made to his younger brother before he'd left the village. Quickly making up his mind, he threw his umbrella down on the ground and raised his hands. "I surrender," he said loudly. "Just let me and my teammates live and I'll give you our plates." Just as his eyes flicked down to his left pocket, he saw a flash of red above him. His heart thudded sickeningly. And then everything turned black. Naruto didn't know what to think, and this, there were no other words for it, simply bewildered him. He was no stranger to pain, and over time, he had gotten into the habit of analyzing the cause of everything that hurt him. He reasoned that to minimize pain, he had to understand it. But what he was feeling now wasn't the usual kind of pain, which was sharp and obvious. Instead, what he felt now was a blunt axe that hacked away at the fraying edges of his mind, as a numbing sense of disbelief and something else he couldn't name spread throughout his body. "So go tell your village and your Hokage. Go tell them that Takigaku's raising up a weapon, in order to become one of the 5 great villages. Come and destroy it for us." Naruto had moved methodically to tighten the rope bindings around the two Takigaku genins, but his mind had already begun to race with the implications. If Mushimi was telling the truth, and his body language and tone all supported that he was, then first of all, this meant that there was more than one tailed beast still roaming the world. Naruto had tried once before to look up information about the 9 tails in the archive library, as he was unable to dismiss the feeling of uneasiness he'd gotten during Mizuki-sensei's Memorial Day lecture. And he had managed to ascertain one thing before being chased out by the Chunin librarian: there was absolutely not even a single scroll on its origins, its known powers, or its fate. Granted, he didn't think that there could have been extensive research on such a colossal force of nature, but the fact that there was absolutely no information on it could mean only one thing: that it was classified, not to be disclosed even to the shinobi. It gave him a headache to think of it, and Naruto had decided that it must have been one of the village's top secrets, something to be handled only by the elite and the Hokage himself, and certainly not by lowly academy students such as himself. And so, he had put his inquisitiveness aside. But now, he found himself being forced back into a similar train of thoughts. And as fearful as the thought of tailed beasts in the plural was, the second implication in the genin's words was, in Naruto's opinion, even worse. that these monsters of legend could actually be sealed away within people. He didn't know much about Fuinjutsu, except that it was a type of jutsu that sealed objects within other objects. He'd always assumed there was a limit to what could be sealed, and what could be done with what was sealed. But if a tailed beast could be sealed within a person, and if that person could somehow harness the tailed beast's chakra, then such a person might very well be invincible. And Mushimi had said that Takigakuer was raising up such a person, a Jinchuriki, he'd called it, in order to become one of the 5 great villages. Did this mean that all of the great villages had a Jinchuriki of their own? A weapon, that by all intents of nature, shouldn't exist? If that was the case, then could the 9 tails not in fact have been destroyed by the 4th Hokage? Could he have sealed it away instead? Inside a person? Maybe even a baby? Naruto suddenly recalled that the 4th had been a sealing master. He had found this out when he'd been trying to figure out what the black seal on his abdomen was. Come to think of it, he hadn't seen his seal in a long time. But that was because it only appeared when he nudged his red chakra. But why was he thinking of his red chakra now? He hadn't touched, or thought of it in years. Come and destroy it for us. Mushimi's hate-filled eyes flashed once more in his mind's memory. Naruto felt another headache coming. He knew those eyes very well. Where had he seen those kinds of eyes before? Hadn't they? Naruto. He jerked in surprise, his hand automatically reaching for the tanto strapped across his back. Besides him, Rai blanched and took a step back, recognizing his teammate. Naruto immediately relaxed and let go of the blade's handle. Looking around, Naruto noted in surprise that the Takigakuer genins were nowhere to be seen. In fact, they seemed to be walking somewhere. For a split second, he couldn't remember where and why they were moving. "What's up with you?" said Rai, eyeing him curiously. Naruto hesitated. "Nothing, I just spaced out," he finally said. The rest of the second exam passed by quickly and easily, despite their increasing misgivings. Naruto's shadow clone found in a Megakuer team with 2 plates that had let their guards down enough for them to be sneaked up on. Mayu's genjutsu incapacitated 2 of them with ease, and after Naruto took down the 3rd with a simple chop across the back of his neck, they trussed up their second genin team to a boulder. With 3 plates now in their possession, they rested briefly before moving onwards, and after several more hours with no further confrontations, they finally reached the end of the maze. They emerged out of the sloping dark tunnel to see that it was midday above ground. They were somewhere in the desert away from the Suna village, and there was not a cloud in the sky. The strong sunlight seared their eyes after having spent days in almost constant darkness. Nevertheless, Rai flung himself on the hot sandy ground with a moan of bliss, soaking up the sunlight with his outstretched arms. Following him outside, a wide smile spread across Mayu's face even as her eyes squinted in pain. Naruto on the other hand, remained tense, his eyes roving around as if looking for possible ambush spots. Rai, seeing this, rolled his watering eyes. "Naruto, we're finally out of that hellhole. Lighten up." Naruto ignored him, continuing his visual search. Rai sighed in long-suffering exasperation. But before he could say anything else, the sound of light footsteps alerted them to a Suna-chunin climbing up the hill towards them. His face was mostly covered with bandages and a face mask, and he wore the standard Suna flak jacket. The man held his hand out. "Plates, please." Immediately, Mayu began to reach inside the folds of her cloak, when Naruto flung out 4 shuriken from his holster. As the shuriken spiraled through the air towards the chunin with a whistling sound, Rai let out a yelp of surprise, but instantly, the chunin had his kunai out, and batted away the shuriken with ease. Mayu stared gapingly down at the shuriken embedded in the ground, and then back up at Naruto. Slowly, the chunin lowered his kunai, and leveled a sharp gaze at Naruto. "Attack an examiner again, and you'll be disqualified from the exam." "What was that for?" Rai demanded. Naruto didn't apologize. "For all we knew, you could have been another examinee trying to take our plates at the very last second." It was difficult to tell the chunin's facial expression from behind his mask, but Naruto could have sworn he saw something twitch. "My name is Tsubusa and I am one of the chunin examiners for this year's chunin selection exam at Sunagakuer. It has been exactly 29 hours and 44 minutes since the exam began. Congratulations on passing the second exam. As Tsubusa led them back to the village, picking his way through a sandy path that only he seemed to be able to see, Naruto noticed several other entrances scattered around the ground. In the distance, he saw another worn-out team emerging up to the ground as Asuna-chan impatiently waited for them. "How do you guys know when to pick us up?" Rai piped up from behind him. "Cameras," said Tsubusa. Contrary to what some may have thought, the second exam was not meant to be an all-out battle royale, with the examiners being blind to its happenings. "And you guys wanted to see what the future ninja of other villages have got up their sleeves, eh?" "That too," Tsubusa admitted. "So did you see that girl that attacked us?" Rai continued. "She creamed us." Naruto stopped short. At the same time, Rai let out a yelp of pain and stumbled forward. It appeared that Mayu had kicked him. "What was that F? Oh. We did not have a camera in every tunnel, so we may have missed that one," Tsubusa replied calmly. Naruto's eyes narrowed. The pause before he'd spoken had been a millisecond too long. Naruto was certain that he was lying. And he would have bet his prized Tonto that every single Suna examiner and official knew of Takigakure's Jinchuriki. But for now, it seemed they would be feigning ignorance. The question was, had they found out from Mushimi's outburst, or had they known even before that? And if they had, why had they let her participate in their exam? Naruto and his team were brought past the village gate and inside one of the circular clay buildings. Contrary to its heavy and dull appearance, it was cool and airy inside, and they gratefully removed their heavy cloaks. Mayu sniffed her sleeve and cringed, thrusting the cloak away from her. To Rai's outrage, they were the second team once again to pass, this time having been beat out by Guy's team of rookies. The three rookies looked battered, but thrilled about their success. When Neji saw them enter, he gave them a cool smirk. With 3 days left as the second exam continued, they were guided to separate quarters where they could clean up, eat, and rest. After taking a long refreshing bath, and saying good night to his teammates, Rai looked disappointed. He had been excited about going out to explore the village, but had been told by Tsubusa that they were not allowed to leave the building until the exam was over in order to prevent sabotage. Naruto turned in early and tossed and turned in his bed all night. The next day, he rose early and was surprised to see that breakfast had been laid just outside his door. It was a tray of Suna cuisine, and nothing that he was used to. The meat was chewy and dry, and his soup, filled with something that looked like seaweed but tasted sweet. Nevertheless, as Naruto ate, he felt a touch of nostalgia, remembering back to the caretaker who had once prepared all of his meals. Strangely enough, he had never seen her again after she left him, and for the first time in years, he wondered where she was. Naruto couldn't even remember her face. All he could remember was that she had been stern, and quick with her hand. He suddenly wondered why he'd been left with a caretaker, and not in the orphanage like every other child in Konoha who'd lost their parents in the war. He'd never thought too deeply of it before, but now, he wondered how he could never have questioned it before. And yet, each question raised even further questions. After breakfast as planned, Naruto and his teammates assembled in the corridor that connected their rooms. Because their own clothes were dirty and being washed, they all wore the dark long tunics that was Suna's traditional clothing. While the clothes were surprisingly lightweight and cool, Naruto privately thought it made them all look lumpy and shapeless. He hadn't noticed the night before because it had been too dark, but now that sunlight had crept into the hallway, Naruto saw that there was a small window that looked outside. Stepping forward and peering out, he realized that it overlooked the center of the village market. The sun was still rising, and hung low in the sky, but he could see the market was already beginning to bustle with activity. "I wonder how many teams passed the second exam," said Rai, with a great yawn. "Since we ended with 3 plates instead of 2, that means we took out 2 teams, right? What do you think the third exam will be?" "Some kind of sparring match, probably," said Mayu, leaning against the wall. "My brother told me that's what most villages do for the third exam when they host the Chunin exams." From what Naruto had been able to gather, Mayu's older brother was a Chunin who manned Konoha's village gates. "Sparring, huh?" said Rai, scratching his nose. "I hope I'm paired with someone easy then. Someone like Tenten or one of those other rookies. And not, let's see. Oh, I know. I really wouldn't like to go up against that, What did they call her? That Jinchuriki then. If she beat Naruto that easily, the rest of us wouldn't stand a chance. Glancing around the corridor to make sure it was empty, his voice nevertheless dropped an octave. Is it even fair though, having her in the exam? We're just genins, even Naruto here wouldn't stand a chance against a tailed beast. Mayu didn't respond. Assuming the third exam involves one-on-one sparring, it's not to say that you have to absolutely win your match to pass, said Naruto. The first two exams were to weed out the weak, now that only the strong genins are left, they'll be wanting us to showcase our abilities. So even if you lose to your opponent, if you make a strong showing, you could still pass. That makes sense, said Rai seriously. And then, a sly smile spread itself across his face, his scar twisting as it did so. Guess Tenten doesn't stand a chance then. Oh, this again. Just leave her alone. What do you have against her? Admonished Mayu. Everything, Rai shot back. Grow up. Tuning out the bickering voices of his teammates, Naruto continued looking out the window. This was the second village outside of his own that he'd ever seen in his life, and the similarities and differences he found were startling to him. The people of Konoha were more boisterous and familiar, greeting each other with wide grins and a slap on the back or a kiss to the cheek. The people of Suna on the other hand seemed much calmer and more reserved. As he watched, though people politely greeted each other good morning, there was always a certain distance between each other. Naruto wondered whether it was merely custom, or whether the extreme climates of the desert bred a certain kind of personality. Yet at the same time, he thought, people here also woke up early to go to the market to buy food to put on the table for their families. Suddenly, there was a loud banging noise just below his window. At the sound, Naruto reared back, his hand reaching for his tanto once more. There was a lull in the cacophony behind him, and striding over, Rai stuck his head out the window and glanced down. Someone just knocked something over, Naruto, he said, turning around. What are you being so jittery for? You've been really weird lately. It's nothing, Naruto said. I'm just tired. Rai shook his head, but let it go. Stretching once more and saying something about looking for the kitchen to get more food, the genin shot off down the corridor. As soon as he disappeared around the corner, Mayu mumbled something about looking for something, and fled into her own room. After a moment's hesitation, Naruto walked back to the window and looked down. Pieces of a red clay pot were scattered on the ground. Though the contents seemed harmless, for some reason, everyone in the market was giving it a wide berth. Standing in the middle, paying no attention to the beans strewn around his feet, was a boy who looked Naruto's age, with spiky auburn hair. But that was where the physical similarities ended. He was much paler, and wore Suna genin attire. Naruto was fairly certain he hadn't seen him in the Chunin exams. He knew he would have remembered someone like that in the exam. The boy was standing stiffly with his arms crossed, seemingly observing the flow of traffic that circled fearfully around him. Then without warning, the boy tilted his head back, and with wrathful black ringed eyes, glared hatefully back up at Naruto. Naruto stepped back away from the window. Retreating to the opposite end of the corridor, where it was still dark, he leaned against the wall and slid down to the ground, massaging his temples. The blunt axe was back again, accompanied once more by that aching headache that prickled and lurked at the edges of his consciousness. I am. He said quietly to the familiar darkness. I am likely a Jinchuriki. Chapter 12, Stalemate. The faint moonlight made the water in the wash basin glow eerily. Looking down at his face reflected on the water's surface, Naruto grimaced as he recalled his recent revelations. He couldn't think of a word to describe how he felt. It was as though he had been blind, and his eyes had been newly opened to the real world. As though a bubble that had separated him from the truth had dissipated. But unfortunately, this reality had never been something he wanted. All of his musings from childhood seemed silly to him now. How could he have never connected the dots before? His entire life, the other villagers had isolated and despised him. Reasoning it out, he had concluded that their driving factor was hatred, and he now knew for sure that he hadn't been wrong there. But now he saw that there was an even bigger factor, namely, fear. He had been orphaned the night that the Nine Tails attacked, but unlike the other orphans, he had been kept separate from them. And that was because the villagers, unlike him, had known that something colossal like the Nine Tails could not have been defeated, not even by the Fourth Hokage, but only sealed away. To think that for 10 years, they had had to live within the same walls as the monster that had killed their loved ones. Naruto gazed down at the whisker-like marks on the face that stared back at him from the water's surface. After a moment, he broke the surface of the water with his hand, contorting his reflection. Why had he never questioned the seal that appeared on his belly when he nudged the red chakra in his body? He had just dismissed it and never thought about it again after his initial curiosity. Naruto felt sick at the vague memory. How many other markers had he missed because of his lack of attention? Suddenly, feeling an overwhelming urge to vomit, he covered his mouth. His headache had been growing increasingly worse all day, and now his head was throbbing again. Panting, Naruto leaned back against the sandy wall for support as his surroundings spun dizzily around him. As soon as the nausea had passed, he splashed some of the cold water on his hot face and then went to lie down on his bed. His heart pounding, he dazedly wondered whether he had contracted some kind of strange desert bug, before his heavy eyes closed shut. The day the second exam ended, everyone who had finished was taken out to the field of dunes where all the tunnels opened up to the surface. With the exception of the Konoha rookies, it was the first time since they had come into Suna that they had seen any of other genins. Taking a cursory look around during their short walk, Naruto noted that besides his and Neji's team, only Kabuto's team had made it from Konoha. However, none of the teams from the other villages seemed to have fared any better. Overall, they looked rather more disheveled and worn down. At the field, as expected, a large number of Suna shinobi officials were waiting. However, standing beside them were a number of foreign jonin, including one very familiar face. Kakashi-sensei. Mayu called out in surprise, coming to a stop. The jonin raised a hand in casual greeting as he strolled over. So you guys are still in one piece, I see. Did you expect any less? Rai snorted, folding his arms across his chest. Ever since he'd been kicked out of the Suna kitchen, he had been in an irritable mood. Are you supposed to be here? Mayu asked skeptically. Hey, now. It's custom for the sensei to be present during the third exam, Kakashi explained. In fact, there are usually a substantial number of spectators from every village during the third exam. After all, the Chunin exam is what decides which ninja will be showing up on the battlefield. Mayu's eyes widened. But all the nations here are allied, aren't they? Alliances can, and have, changed in a heartbeat, said Kakashi in a solemn voice. The man, or woman, you shared a drink with over the campfire could be the one to stab you in the back when the fire dies. Suddenly, he clapped his hands together, startling them. But enough of that business. You three should just concentrate on the upcoming exam. As if taking that as a cue, the Suna Chunin who had picked them up, Tsubusa, raised a hand in signal. Kakashi, as well as the other foreign jonin returned back to their formation. When the genin had all amassed into a single group, he spoke. As of now, the second test of the Tsunagaku Chunin exam is, the rest of his sentence was cut off, as with a sudden flurry of sand, a red and white figure burst out of one of the tunnel holes in the ground. Whew. I almost overslept, that was way too close. As one, all heads turned to stare at the genin who casually brushed the sand off her head. Isn't that, Fu? Rai hissed unnecessarily into Naruto's ear. Hearing her name, the green-haired Kunoichi looked their way with an unexpectedly hard expression on her face, and Rai involuntarily took a step back. Ahem, Tsubusa caught their attention with a cough. As I was saying, as of now, the second test of the Tsunagaku Chunin exam is now over. Taking into account the most recent arrival, 24 individuals coming from a total of 11 teams have passed. Congratulations. At this point, a particularly bedraggled-looking Amet team was unable to contain their joy, triumphantly thrusting the tips of their umbrellas up into the air. The Kaze Kage will now address you all. Tsubusa nodded towards the group of Suna shinobi, which parted in the middle to reveal a robed figure of middling size. Stern dark eyes bored into them from beneath the green pointed hat that denoted him as the strongest shinobi of Tsunagaku. Congratulations on making it this far, said the Kaze Kage in a deep and raspy voice. However, it is too early to celebrate. He pointedly looked towards the celebrating members of the Amet team, who shrunk under his gaze. the Chunin exam is a valuable tool for evaluating the performances of the future generations of shinobi. You can think of everything until now as a preliminary test to weed out the worthless from those with potential. It is only from this point onwards that your mettle will truly be tested. The third exam, which will take place 2 weeks from now, will be a series of fights in which you must be the victor, in order to proceed to the next round. Rai nudged Mayu, who had paled. I cannot stress enough the importance of your display during this third exam. You may be merely genin now, but you will, in the future, be the soldiers of your village. In a sense, you are showing the strength of your village to the other villages. A weak showing will reflect poorly on your village, and invite stronger villages to take advantage. In essence, from here on out, you are determining the futures of your villages. The Kazekage looked balefully around at them. It was completely quiet. Now, according to your individual performances from the first and second exams, every person, with no regard for nation or team, has been divided into 8 separate brackets. The victors of each bracket will face each other, until there is only one remaining, who will be guaranteed a pass in the exams. Breaking the silence, the group of genins began to murmur amongst each other. The Kazekage raised a hand to quell them. This does not mean, however, that only one person will be passing. From this moment on, every single one of you is being considered for a promotion to the Chunin rank. So I expect you all, as representatives of your respective villages, to prove yourselves in these rounds. At these words, a tall and bald Suna Jonin stepped forward. Thank you, Kazekage-sama. I will take it from here, said the Jonin, bowing deeply. He straightened up and turned to look at them. My name is Seiritsu, and I will be the head referee for the third exam. To start things off, due to the larger than expected number of remaining contenders, there will be a preliminary round. You will be divided into divisions where 3, instead of 2, genins will fight each other. There will be no rules besides that you must remain in this field. The fight will continue until 2 of you are dead, knocked out, or admit defeat. There may also be a situation in which the winner has been clearly decided. Rather than unnecessarily adding blood to the field, I will step in and declare the victor. He cleared his throat. Now then, you were each individually evaluated during the first and second exams, and using these results, the divisions have been drawn to be as fair as possible. Several Sunachunin rolled out a large white cloth with a tournament bracket chart etched on it in dull black ink. Naruto found his name immediately. It was the first name written in the very first bracket. The 2 names next to his were Kabuto and Karen. Scanning the rest of the brackets, he saw that almost all the other Konoha genin had been split up into separate brackets. It seemed that by fair, they had meant that they intended the strongest genins to face each other in the later rounds of the tournament rather than in the preliminary. Likely to provide the most entertainment for the various high-ranking country officials that would be coming to view the actual third exam. His gaze lingered momentarily on Mayu's bracket, which was 4th. One of the names was unfamiliar to him, but the other name was Fu. Either they had scribbled Fu's name into one of the brackets as soon as she emerged, or more likely, they had known she had passed, and had proactively written her in. Naruto glanced at Mayu, but for once, her face was unreadable. We will commence with the preliminary round of the third exam immediately. First up is Bracket 1, Uzumaki Naruto from Konoha, Yakushi Kabuto from Konoha, and Karen of Kyuzagakur. They're sure not wasting any time, Rai grumbled, scratching his scar. Good luck, Naruto. Not that you need it. Mayu nodded. Good luck, Naruto. Wordlessly, Naruto stepped out onto the field. Kabuto walked past him, his sandaled feet crunching in the sand, and turned around to face him several meters away. A bespectacled girl with flaming bright red hair and eyes wearing a Kyuzagakur Hitai did the same, finishing the triangle. At the same time, several Suna Jonin stepped out, and with a jutsu, raised a circular sand barrier that separated the bystanders from the 3 genin, creating a makeshift arena. Are you ready? Said Seiritsu. Yes, said Naruto and Karen simultaneously. Kabuto silently adjusted his glasses. Then, begin. The girl seemed to have judged Kabuto as the easier of the 2, she immediately flung several kunai in his direction. Barely dodging them, Kabuto tripped over his own feet, and fell on the ground. Karen began running towards him, but skidded to a stop when he raised his hand. There was a momentary silence, before Seitsu cleared his throat. Yes. I forfeit, Kabuto said, looking embarrassed. He stood up, dusting the sand off his pants, and began to limp back to the wall of the barrier. My foot's been bothering me since the second exam, and I doubt I can carry on much longer. Personally, Naruto thought that the limp looked fake. It was much more likely that Kabuto had ascertained that he had no chance against the competition of that year, and had just chickened out. That was so not cool, man, said Rai, shaking his head. Hearing him, Kabuto gave a sheepish smile before going to the back to sit beside his teammates. Okay then, Kabuto Yakushi from Konoha has been eliminated from bracket 1, Seitsu rolled his eyes. He raised his hand once more. Continue. Naruto hadn't moved since stepping out onto the field. This seemed to unsettle the Kusa genin. Hesitating for a second, she flung another pair of kunai at Naruto. Deflecting the kunai with his own, Naruto stayed otherwise still. Running around him in circular motions, Karen continued to throw kunai at him, all of which he blocked. Finally, apparently having run out of artillery, she launched herself at him with surprising speed, leaving a small cloud of sand in her wake. Feinting to the right, she ducked and swiped at his feet to try and knock him off balance. Naruto twisted, and kicked at her open back. She grunted at the direct hit, but to his surprise, reached behind her to wrap her arms around his leg. Again, with a surprising amount of strength, Karen pushed up, propelling him into the air. Jumping up, she punched at him. However, Naruto ducked, and quicker than she could react, he grabbed a hold of her collar. Her eyes widened just as he slammed her down to the ground. Her body hit the ground with enough impact to cause deep cracks to appear in the ground around her. A cloud of dust and sand erupted around Karen's groaning figure. Naruto nimbly landed several meters away. When the dust had cleared, however, he noted with some surprise that Karen had already gotten up. Furthermore, aside from a slightly dazed expression, she seemed unhurt. An impressed murmur spread throughout the watching crowd. Naruto gazed impassively at her figure. Contrary to her rather flimsy appearance, she was quite sturdy. If he continued to fight her the way he had planned to, it would likely only drag out for a long time as he slowly whittled away at her defenses. Making up his mind, he brought his hands together. Futon, Kyavua, wind release, gale. A gust of wind spiraled into existence, picking up sand and forming a large dust cloud that engulfed the entire arena. There were yelps of indignant pain from the group of genins, as some of the sand blew into their eyes. Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, Shadow Clone Technique. Under the cloud of the dust, Naruto created 4 shadow clones. Karen meanwhile had stood rooted in her position, bracing herself. She seemed fairly intelligent, and had likely predicted Naruto's intentions under the cover of dust. However, there was little she could do against 5 assailants. As his clones distracted her, Naruto crept in from her blind spot. Raising his kunai, he aimed at the back of her neck, prepared to deal the finishing blow, when suddenly, as if she had known he'd been the real one the whole time, Karen twisted her head to look directly at him. With flashing red eyes, she flung a kunai at him, and for the first time, he was forced to jump back in retreat. Appraising the red-headed genin from afar, Naruto cocked his head in bemusement. Interesting, either it had been a lucky guess, which he doubted, or she had some sort of sensory ability that allowed her to differentiate between clones. If that was the case, his current plan wouldn't work either, and the ball was back in Karen's court. She seemed to have reached the same conclusion, apparently not having yet exhausted her supply of kunai. She resumed throwing them at him, warily maintaining her distance. Just the same as before, Naruto continued blocking them, creating a momentary standstill. For several moments, it was silent except for the sound of metal clashing on metal as the two stared at each other, waiting for the other to make the first move. Finally, Karen seemed to have grown impatient. Her final pair missed him entirely, flying over his head. At the same time, she propelled herself headfirst in his direction once more. Prepared, Naruto reached behind him for his tanto. Just before Karen reached him, he took a small leap backwards, focusing his wind chakra along the blade of his tanto. He pulled out the tanto in a single, fluid motion. Upon seeing the blade, Karen immediately stopped and began to reverse direction. Out of fear, he thought for a split moment, when he suddenly heard something hissing behind him. Still looking directly at Karen, Naruto saw the tips of her lips curl up into a small smile, and in the same split second, saw belatedly that her hands were in the snake hand seal. Then, before he even had enough time to widen his eyes, there was a loud explosion as the exploding tags behind him detonated. A collective gasp swept through the crowd as a large violent ball of fire engulfed Naruto's figure. The billowing smoke rapidly filled the entire arena. Naruto! Mayu choked out in a shocked voice. She moved forward as if to run in, but was stopped by a raised hand from Kakashi, who had suddenly appeared beside them during the ruckus. Kakashi silently shook his head at her. Meanwhile, leaping over the barrier, the referee ninja had disappeared into the thick smoke. What happened? Rai gasped, wide-eyed. It seems that your genius was outsmarted, said Neji, folding his arms across his chest. Fu let out an admiring whistle. Naruto, outsmarted? Rai repeated dumbly. Kakashi-sensei, what? The Jonin didn't respond. You better start getting ready for your match, Tenten, said Neji, turning to his teammate. Looking dazed, she seemed startled at his suggestion. Right, she said weakly. The winner of preliminary round 1. Seiditsu's bodiless voice emerged from the smoke, recapturing their attention. Neji closed his eyes, nodding his head in affirmation. Is Uzumaki Naruto? Neji's eyes snapped open in shock. There was a momentary pause of collective confusion. What? Called out a genin. You sure you haven't gotten the names wrong? Yeah. We saw Karen win, said the girl next to him. I can't see anything, another genin complained. In response, one of the jonin raised a large metal fan and waved it once towards the arena. Immediately, a strong wind swept through once more, this time taking away the smoke, to reveal a completely different scene from the one they had been left with. Karen was sitting motionlessly on her knees, with a look of fear frozen on her face. Naruto stood just as still behind her, one hand gripping the top of her red hair while the other held the blade of his tanto to the front of her neck. As mentioned earlier, I can decide during a match if a victor is made clear, growled Seiditsu. Now, lower your tanto. For a tangibly tense second, Naruto didn't move, looking down at the girl with a blank expression on his face. A thin trickle of bright blood slid down his blade and dripped down onto the sand. He'd been in this position before, and seen this scene before, he thought distantly. Karen let out a pained whimper. Upon hearing her, as though breaking out of a reverie, Naruto released his grip on her head and slid the tanto back into its strap on his back. Karen slumped onto the ground, several medicnin hurried over to the genin's prone figure. Ignoring the murmuring and questioning gazes of the crowd, Naruto jumped over the barrier and walked over to Kakashi's side. What happened? Rai said eagerly in a tone of great relief that indicated that the world was as it should be once more. I thought that even you wouldn't have enough time to dodge that. I did, said Naruto shortly. Good ol' Naruto, said Rai, slinging his arm around his head. You scared me there for a sec. Mayutu, right. He nudged the pale-faced girl beside him, who nodded mutely. I thought that maybe that flu you caught had made you slower or something. The flu? Kakashi questioned, reaching out with a hand to Naruto. Naruto, were you sick? Taken aback, Naruto shook his head. No, I'm fine. Of course you are, Rai beamed. He turned to Mayu. I'm more worried about you. My fight's gonna be a piece of cake but, you're up against that Jinchuriki girl. In an unusual slip of his composure, Kakashi's hand jerked. At that, Naruto turned to regard his teammate in bewilderment. What was Rai talking about? Jinchuriki. He repeated slowly. He couldn't recall ever having heard that word before. And yet for some reason, the word did not feel unfamiliar on his tongue. Something throbbed in his head, and Naruto winced. Yeah, said Rai obliviously, waving his hand. You know. That girl Fu. But before he could ask him what a Jinchuriki was, the second round of the preliminaries began. That's it for part 2. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.